Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be going over Chapter 33 of the American Pageant titled Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Shadow of War from 1933 to 1941. As always, we're going to be using the 16th edition of the American Pageant. If you have an earlier or later edition or a completely different textbook, don't worry about it, the content's going to be the same. So to start off, let's talk about key concepts, or rather lack thereof. Obviously, I no longer put in the key concepts because it's copyrighted material, but if you want to reference them, which I highly recommend you do at some point, they can be found at the beginning of every chapter in the textbook. At least that's how it is in the American Pageant. Overall, I really recommend using it because it's a great resource for retaining information and actually referencing it during the AP exam or any other test you may take. So I highly recommend you try it at least once, and overall, it's just really going to help you categorize information. Okay, so to start off, let's talk about FDR's foreign policy. Obviously, his foreign policy is pretty much going to dictate how he handles the oncoming World War II and how he, in general, sets the tone for America's foreign policy for decades to come. And the first major event you should know about is the London Economic Conference in 1933. Nations hoped to coordinate an international response to the global depression by stabilizing currency and rates at which they could be exchanged. However, FDR later opposed the conference because it would interfere with his own plans for domestic recovery, and ultimately the conference failed and nothing much was really done there. This strengthened the global trend of nationalism and isolationism, as FDR's every man for himself attitude plunged the world into further economic crisis, allowing dictators like Hitler, as we're going to see in just a couple years from now, to become more powerful. And in addition to these isolationist policies, the US withdrew from Asia and granted the Philippines its freedom in 1946 because they didn't want to waste supplies on protecting them if a global conflict were to break out. So clearly, FDR is just trying to prepare for a war because he knows it's coming, and he also wants to save the country when it's crippling from a depression. However, FDR did break his rather isolationist foreign policy at some points. For example, he formally recognized the Soviet Union, hoping to establish a trade relationship that would outweigh the growing German power in Europe and the Japanese power in Asia. FDR also implemented the Good Neighbor policy, which started because he wanted to improve relations with Latin America, which, as we know, the US has a huge history of constantly intervening in Latin American affairs under the guise of concern for their citizens, when in reality they had their own ulterior motives, usually economic or financial or whatever. He denounced intervention and ordered the US Marines to leave Haiti and got rid of the Platt Amendment in Cuba. So already he's trying to sort of show them that he respects them, not as someone inferior to the US, but rather an equal. In business disputes with Latin America, he always resolved the situation with negotiations, which leads Latin America to trust FDR. And during this time, Roosevelt also suggested that the US should stick to being a regional power with interests confined to the Western Hemisphere instead of aiming to be a dominant world power. So again, we're seeing more of these isolationist beliefs. You should also know about the Reciprocal Trade Agreement of 1934. This was created by Secretary of State Hull, who believed that tariff barriers blocked foreign trade, which could lead to trade wars and eventually real wars. Essentially, this act allowed the president to lower tariffs on any country who reciprocated, or in other words, did the same for the US. As a result, US foreign trade increases drastically, strengthening economic relations with Latin America, and overall serves as an international influence for peace. So although this overall agreement had isolationist intentions of simply keeping ties with the countries who actually mattered, it ended up making the US more involved in global trade. So although, as we'll see with many of these things, although the US does want to sort of keep to themselves and make sure that they don't get involved in any other wars, a lot of the things they do inadvertently do get them involved in war. So moving on, let's talk more about what exactly happens leading up to World War II. For example, you should know about totalitarianism, which was the idea that the individual must always be obedient to the government, and this began to spread globally. For example, you see it in Stalin, who emerges as the dictator of the communist USSR, executing thousands of people who didn't agree with him, also known as dissidents. You should also know about Mussolini, who was a fascist. He comes to power in Italy around 1922. And finally, of course, you should know about Hitler, who comes to power in Germany around 1933, promising various liberal reforms to the unemployed, which he obviously didn't actually care about because he was a demagogue. During this time, you're also going to see that both Japan and Germany are going to withdraw from international organizations and treaties, like the League of Nations and the Washington Naval Treaty. Meanwhile, Mussolini attacks Ethiopia in 1935. And because there are so many dictators competing with each other during this time, Hitler and Mussolini make an agreement known as the Rome-Berlin Axis in 1936. Essentially, it was an informal alliance that strengthened the bond between the two countries, but it wasn't really anything official, as we'll see later on. Aside from that, domestically, you should know about the Johnson Debt Default Act of 1934. This was really created because the US was feeling spiteful towards other nations who they'd loaned money to during World War I who still hadn't paid them back. So this act prevented nations who weren't paying back their debts from borrowing more money from the US, which furthers this isolationist sentiment. One really important organization you should know about is the Nye Commission. This was created by Senator Nye, and it said that the US had only entered World War I because greedy weapons manufacturers wanted to make a profit. And although this is technically true, they did make a huge profit from the war, it was exaggerated in order to shift the blame from the German U-bombers to domestic causes. So this would make the recent attacks on Ethiopia, which again we talked about, Mussolini attacked Ethiopia in 1935, and the rise of dictators globally seem almost normal, which would make the public less enthusiastic about starting a war in order to maintain the isolationism that the US had already started. So Senator Nye is basically putting all of the blame on domestic weapons manufacturers to make it seem like whatever happens in the world isn't really much of US concern. Obviously, that wasn't the case when the US entered World War I. That's the reason why they entered World War I. But they're trying to convince the public that whatever's happening outside is not something that they need to worry about unless they're directly involved, which at this point they aren't. So it's really in hopes of sort of stifling any pro-war efforts that people might be thinking of right now. And in order to further dissuade people from even considering what's happening globally or to even think that war was necessary, the US passes the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1936, and 1937. This ultimately was passed because the US regretted their role in World War I and wanted to remain neutral in the recent global conflicts. It stated that when the president claimed the existence of a foreign war, certain restrictions would go into effect, like bans on giving loans to foreign nations, sailing on their ships, and selling munitions to them. However, by not helping their democratic allies at all in order to preserve total neutrality, the US intentionally gave more power to the dictators because they weren't giving anything to the allies or, to their democratic allies, so the dictators naturally became more powerful. Meanwhile, the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, allowing the fascist rebel leader, General Francisco Franco, to overthrow the loyalist regime that the Soviet Union supported with the aid of Mussolini and Hitler. And as a result of this, the US sends a small group of American volunteers known as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade to fight the rebels. So this is really proof of an American passion for upholding democracy globally, but it isn't enough to bring them into war just yet. So although morally the US does want to help them, they don't have the resources to do so. Maybe if they do, they don't feel like spending an exorbitant amount on it when they aren't directly involved in it. This further encouraged the dictators, making them believe that they could take control without any international or diplomatic consequences. So again, we're seeing that dictators are becoming very overconfident and are becoming more bold and are willing to take a bit more risks. And you see this when Japan invades China in 1937, but FDR still refuses to call the attack grounds for war, so the neutrality legislation isn't put into effect. This meant that Japan was still able to buy munitions from the US. However, FDR didn't do nothing. Soon after the attack, he delivered the Quarantine Speech of 1937, where he suggested using economic embargoes to, quote, quarantine the aggressors. Isolationists opposed the idea because it would quickly lead to an armed conflict, so FDR doesn't follow through with the plan and looks for other indirect methods to curb the dictators without getting directly involved in the war. However, this speech was pretty useless. I mean, it's basically just words. He hasn't really done anything yet. So naturally, the dictators keep on going at the pace they're going at. We see later in 1937, Japanese planes sunk the US ship Panay, but eventually apologized for doing so. Soon after, in 1938, Hitler invades Austria, and later that year at the Munich conference, the Western democratic countries gave Hitler the Sudetenland in the hopes that it would stop the rapid expansion of his empire, but it didn't. And a really important simile that I like to sort of use to remember this is, think about like a dog and giving a dog a treat. If you give a dog a treat, you would expect that it would be satisfied with that maybe. It might ask for some later, but for now, it's satisfied. But the problem is that if the dog knows that you'll give it that treat, that you'll give it that concession, it's going to keep asking you in the hopes that give them eventually a bigger reward. Obviously, you don't want to give them that bigger reward. That's why you're giving them small treats here and there. But in reality, it's going to build up and eventually become that big reward. So it's a very interesting simile, and that's sort of how I remember the situation. But in general, one really important term you should know about is appeasement. Essentially, all democratic world leaders followed this policy in order to avoid another world war by not taking direct action whenever a fascist country, namely Germany, did something bad. However, Germany does take advantage of this lenient policy, as we see when they take the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. So they're trying to provide as much leeway as possible unless they're being directly attacked. Currently, they aren't being directly attacked, not any of the major powers at least, so it's not really a concern for them. And while Germany is conquering all of this land, Russia shocks the world by signing the Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939. This created an informal alliance that allowed them to unite against Western countries. Essentially, this allowed for German aggression against Poland and Western democracies without any fear of retaliation by the Soviet Union. So this is a huge step in sort of furthering Hitler's power against the Western countries. And soon after this pact is signed, World War II officially starts on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invades Poland, causing Britain and France to declare war. And although America did want to help Poland, Britain, and France, they didn't want to get involved in the war because, again, it costs money, resources, time, which they did not have. So the US decides that they will only help by providing the Western countries with munitions. And this led to a revised Neutrality Act known as the Neutrality Act of 1939, which said that European democracies could buy US munitions if they paid in cash and carried it on their own ships, known as the cash and carry policy. This also allowed FDR to serve democratic interests while also avoiding war debts, loans, and the sinking of American ships. Additionally, all of this building and giving supplies helped restart the economy following the Great Depression. Meanwhile, Hitler continued expanding throughout 1940, taking over Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, and Belgium. So now the US is concerned because England is the only country left before Hitler will have total control over Europe. And so in September of 1940, the US passes a conscription law, which is the first peacetime draft. There really is no other choice for them at this point. And obviously, there are a lot of atrocities happening in Germany. One you should really know about is Kristallnacht in 1938. This is also known as the Night of Broken Glass, and it really started after the Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels gives a speech condemning the Jewish, encouraging violence against them. This leads to almost 100 Jewish people being killed, destroying Jewish businesses and synagogues, and 30,000 were sent to concentration camps. And this is another factor in what really pushes the US to sort of get involved in Germany. In fact, after hearing reports about Nazi genocide, FDR forms the War Refugee Board in 1942 to save Hungarian Jews from being deported to the concentration camps in Auschwitz. However, most of the board's work was done after millions of Jews had already been murdered, so it didn't really make much of a significant difference, and by the end of the Holocaust, 6 million Jews had been murdered. And especially after Hitler's air attacks on Britain, the US sort of split into two schools of thought regarding what the next step should be. One was represented by the America First Committee. You can probably guess what they stood for. Essentially, they said that instead of trying to help other countries, America should focus on concentrating all military resources toward defending their own shores. So it really shows that isolationists would do anything to fight the Nazis except go to actual war. Meanwhile, the other school of thought was represented by the Committee to Defend America by Aiding Allies. They supported the idea of providing aid to Britain to ultimately defeat Hitler, and so in 1940, FDR sends 50 warships to Britain, who, in exchange, give the US some very valuable defense sites. So essentially, the US is no longer officially neutral. In terms of domestic affairs, you should know about the election of 1940. FDR decides to run for a third term, which at this point is still legal because the two-term limit only existed in tradition. It wasn't really a set rule, it's just what the norm was. And meanwhile, Republicans chose Wendell Willkie as their candidate, who condemned what he called FDR's dictatorship. However, obviously FDR wins the election because he seems capable of guiding the nation amidst another world war. So not only would it be very destabilizing to choose a new leader during an already vulnerable time for the US, but Americans know that FDR is reliable and that he has taken them out of a crisis before. So obviously they're going to rely on his leadership a bit more, and Willkie didn't really stand a chance to begin with. But back to foreign affairs, you should know about the Lend-Lease Bill in 1941. This allowed the US to send unlimited ammunition to countries who were defending themselves against the Axis powers, and weapons would be returned after the war ended so that there would be no war debts. Although it was praised for keeping the US out of war, at least directly, they're not completely neutral, but they're not directly in the war anymore, it was obviously pretty faulty. Because, how do you return used weapons? How exactly does that work? And countries obviously are going to ask for a lot of money from the US. Soon after the Lend-Lease Bill is passed, Hitler attacks the Soviet Union in 1941, hoping to take oil and other resources that they could use to defeat Britain. So in response, the US sends aid to the USSR, and this is very shocking because, as we remember, they signed the Hitler-Stalin Pact not too long ago, so clearly Hitler doesn't really care about these alliances. They don't really mean anything to him. It's just under the guise of maintain relations with certain countries, when in reality he will go behind their backs if it means getting the land that he needs. And so as a result of this, FDR and British Prime Minister Churchill meet in Newfoundland and discuss the Atlantic Charter in 1941 as well, which outlined a path for future disarmament, peace, and a permanent system for security. This led to the creation of the United Nations and raised awareness about human rights after World War II. It also said that there would be no territorial changes contrary to the wishes of the inhabitants and affirmed the right of the people to choose their own government, which furthers the overall ideals of self-determination and self-rule. Meanwhile, Germany is still sinking US ships, which leads the US to repeal the Neutrality Act of 1939. And at the same time, since Japan is still allied with Germany, the US offered to lift its trade embargo on Japan if they stopped attacking China, but Japan refused and they continued fighting. And all of these tensions that are building with Japan especially are going to culminate in the Pearl Harbor attack of December 7th, 1941, where Japanese bombers attacked the American base in Hawaii, causing over 3,000 deaths and severe damage to numerous small vessels and aircrafts. So now the US is actually going to get directly involved. Soon after this, the US declares war on Japan, while Germany and Italy declare war on the US. And ultimately, your big takeaway from Pearl Harbor is that it united Americans to finally enter the war, but also led to detrimental civil rights violations of innocent Japanese Americans living in the US, as we'll see in the next chapter. And yeah, that does it for this chapter. Here are the credits for how I got everything you just saw. Thank you so much for watching. Comment below if you have any questions. Please be sure to like, subscribe. You know the drill. It really helps me out and lets me know that these videos are helpful for you so that I can make more videos in the future. So yeah, see you in the next video.